And I've just observed that so many of the extremely bright Indians have gone back from being educated in Europe and the United States, and they're starting entrepreneurial companies. And the Indians are very skilled technically, particularly in the computer software and computer service systems, and they're very good businessmen. So we're seeing these two emerging countries, India and China, with huge opportunities. But my goodness, you've got to be very competitive and very smart, and particularly have good Indian and Chinese partners. So now I'm going to go back around, and remember, I wanted to be more specific about what's the best idea you have and what's the thing that keeps you awake at night. And I'm going to start. What keeps me awake at night is time. We're running out of time with the incredible explosion of new technologies. And remember, technologies advance at an exponential rate. We've heard this from a number of our very bright panelists. Political systems, economic systems advance at a sort of a mathematical rate, not an exponential rate. And so I think we're running out of time to set up the financial, the governance infrastructures to deal with these the speed of technology. That's what keeps me awake at night, trying to find solutions to that. The best opportunity I heard was on a panel that was at Yale recently, and Robert Schiller, who has the Schiller real estate thing, he was on a panel there with what's his name, Steve. Let me see what Steve's last name is. I know him very well. Steve Roach, who was now at Yale, and he was the chief economist for Morgan Stanley. And the subject of this was new structures of global finance. And what we were discussing was to have in Hong Kong or Singapore or Bermuda, could be other places, a new United Nations-like site to be a true new global financial center, not linked to any nation state like the United Nations, where companies, where organizations could be registered, where they could be traded, and where the entire service providers could also develop global standards of accounting, of laws, of intellectual property, of compensation, and even including a new global currency. And I'm not going to get into that, but it's a very exciting idea. And so what I'd like to do now is go right back down the line and ask each of our members what keeps them awake at night and what's the best idea they've heard, and then we'll quickly open it up to the audience. So Zach?
What keeps me awake at night? Part of what keeps me awake at night is the relentless tendency of people in the West these days to be worried to the point of panic about the future arc of the world. And so the kind of collective fear and panic of Americans and Europeans, particularly those involved in finance, that the world is continually on the brink of a precipice simply because things got ahead of themselves and opaque and black boxed and derivative based in 2008, and the degree to which that has a lingering psychological effect, I find troubling, because when a small group of people who are at the apex of something that is kind of essential to the smooth functioning of a global system are frequently animated by collective hysteria, that is a source of concern, when the world as it is doesn't really keep me up much at all, because I think, in fact, as a number of us have indicated, there is a degree of wealth creation and affluence and unlocking of human capital and human potential in the world today that cannot be overstated and is happening more rapidly and affecting more people more rapidly than any conceivable point in human history. And whether that's China or South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa or Brazil or Russia, even with a declining population, has a vastly increasing income stream, or Turkey, which I would agree, Turkey is probably the most important country that we pay the least attention to. And Brazil gets a lot of attention now, so we can,
Okay.
But I'd probably put Indonesia in that category too. So if we had someone talking about Indonesia. But the mismatch between that reality and, again, the financial center's view of the world, which is so colossally negative that if you're not in it, it's almost hard to imagine just how Armageddon-ish people are about their view of what's going on. And I know the financial world, if I were, in 40 years, I'm sure I'll look back and go, this has always been the case, and people in finance are prone to bouts of manic hysteria and passive anxiety. But the degree to which that sits at the center of an essential component to the smooth functioning of the system concerns me, but it also makes me realize that I think we're chronically underestimating the pure strength of global growth. I've written about this about China, and I would continue to write about it, and put my money where my mouth is about the nature of that global growth theme, which is, I'm sure, something we're going to be talking about for many
Okay, I'm
years.
going to stop you there because I'm watching Paul in the back of the room, and so we're going to stick to the nightmares. What keeps you awake at night? So we'll have enough time to have some questions for the audience. So thanks for your nightmares.
Well, mine was both a nightmare and a dream.
And dreams.
So.
Now, Vladimir, what keeps you awake at night?
First of all, narrow answer. Several countries translated my book. It was okay for me because I didn't know these languages. But then one Russian publishing house bought rights to translate my book. And when I saw first chapter in Russian, I told them never show anybody because it was a total disaster. And now I am translating my own book, which is written in English, back in Russian. It's number one. Number two, I am working with another book which address issue which John mentioned. Why China is now everywhere? Why Ghana, which used to be definitely leading democratic country in Africa and one of the leading in terms of rate of growth, much ahead of other small democracies in Asia, behind? Simple answer. China is one of the few countries and only big country which has a national strategy. And national strategy of China was developed back in 70s when Mao Zedong returned Deng Xiaoping from labor camp. And strategy has one emphasis. I read the strategy thanks to maybe KGB, I don't know who translated it in Russian, in 80s. And main term of the strategy, extension, not expansion, extension to other nations. This is why you can see 30% in some countries like Chad of Chinese population. This is why China is getting resources from around the world. Number one. Number two other countries with strategy, only two. I know only 3 countries with defined national strategy. It's Singapore and South Korea. South Korea was agricultural backyard of North Korea, but political freedom, economic freedom makes South Korea ahead technologically of all countries. Ghana still do not have national strategy. Ghana definitely has freedom and one of the most free country of sub-Saharan Africa. Very short time for sub-Saharan Africa. I have to tell you that global multilateral institutions do not have strategy to sub-Saharan Africa except make some help. But corporations found the strategy. It's called bottom of pyramid. They found way how to be profitable, business about profit, how to be profitable to address these poor nations. They change everything, and I see how Coca-Cola became profitable in sub-Saharan Africa and addressing needs of people in South Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, not just taking money.
Okay, now, unfortunately, we're going to run out of time, and you guys have so many good ideas. I'm surprised you have time to sleep because all these things churning in your mind. David, how about you?
I'm going to keep this very short and sweet. The thing that keeps me up at night is American provincialism. We don't speak foreign languages. And that really, I think we're competitively going to be increasingly at a loss in this respect. The flip side, the solution, if I may, very quickly, is bring back something like the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps brought more people into this country or trained more people who knew foreign languages and had actually lived there. It doesn't have to be the same thing. It cannot be the same thing. but we need something that will make us functionally able to work in the world, not just here in New York and not just at home.
Thank you, thank you. Aaron, how about you?
I think we made a very false and bad start to the 21st century, especially grassroots policies was the main course. And I do believe that we have to find ways to better manage, better harmonize, better interact our civilization. And multilateral international organizations should do more. In my area of business, Basel was defined as a very dull city. And I have worries that the outcome in finance will not necessarily help, the regulatory outcome will not necessarily help for a better functioning world economy. So we have to perhaps think about a strategy of globalization, not necessarily a strategy of nations themselves.
Good, thank you. Sean, what keeps you awake at night?
The fact that we are stuck in a paradigm which has been very successful for about 50 years and has provided a metric of success which we all slavishly follow. So mindless pursuit of aggregate incrementalism in wealth and consumption is the defining feature of the global environment. The world's most enthusiastic, accretive capitalists today live in Shanghai. The models that have proved to be successful, but which have pushed us to the point, firstly, of diminishing returns, and secondly, the risk of systemic crisis, are now being followed by an increasingly large number of people. That's not a sustainable policy over the long term, and the flip side of that is thinking about what the dream would be, which is rather like your friend Jim with his 2 trips around the world, redefining the quality of life that people can aspire to that will enable 7 billion people to live on this planet and 9 billion eventually by 2050 in conditions of increasing, if you want to phrase, eco-affluence that will allow us to live within limits and at the same time continue to exploit the opportunities which are present in this huge surge of technology, adequate availability of capital, and extraordinary human growth in terms of the middle class.
Good. Thank you. Alberto.
Okay. Nightmare and a dream. I think the nightmare all over Latin America, and especially in South America, is that one day China stops buying our commodity exports. That would be the end of the, for 20 years. Because we don't have a contingency plan. We are not prepared to increase the added value of our exports at this point. So that would be a nightmare. A dream is that in this world of crisis, in this world where the traditional actors are kind of refraining from playing how they used to do, there's plenty of opportunities. We're seeing a lot of opportunities South-South. South America and Africa, South America and the Arab countries, South America and Southeast Asia, South America and India. So lots of things going on, and lots of opportunities and lots of possibilities of eventually, who knows, bringing some contribution to historical problems of the civilization.
Great, thank you. I love these conferences because I learn so much. And so I'd like to thank all of the panelists for the education they gave to me and hopefully to you. So thank you all. And now Samuel Johnson always said the most important decision that anybody makes in the course of a day is what to have for dinner. And I'm sure everybody's hungry, but I don't know whether we have enough time. Louise, do we have enough time for some questions? Or anybody else out there? Do we have a few questions we can have time for?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Why don't we, I see if somebody has some microphones, I see a few hands up. Here's, all right. Jody?
I just was curious with these rapid growth rates in the BRICS countries, if you see globalization slowing to the extent, and slowing may not be the right word, but benefiting a few countries and the rest going at a much slower pace, as, in other words, Brazil, Russia, India, China, if there will be a few countries that will be magnets for the continued globalization versus more the diffuse spread of it that we've seen over the last 10 years.
I'm going to let Vladimir answer that because he just wrote this book, The Global Emerging Market.
With pleasure.
And so I think you probably have some good insights.
First of all, globalization is very powerful, but one of the about 10 most powerful global trends. For example, Alberto mentioned that multi-Latina. It's influence of another trend, regionalization. They exist. Another global trend, democratization. And there is no way that any country in the world can be out of influence these trends. Not all of them positive, some of them extremely negative. For example, shortage of capital and the most dangerous global extension of terrorism and extremism. So mankind has to be ready to prepare a strategy how to use different global trends and how to be ready to fight, to oppose different global trends. They're objective. You cannot just ignore them.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you, Jody. Other questions? Here's a young man over here, if he has a microphone. Yes, sir.
John, my question is what Mr. Arvind said. The strategy
could you
for
introduce yourself, please?
My name is Babulal Jain. I work with the UNOP for MDGs.
Thank you.
He mentioned about strategy for globalization. And that point, I want to say the stakeholders of concern for sustainable living are the most important points for now and for future economic growth. What are the comments from Arvind or others?
Okay. Let me see. Sean, how about you?
Sure.
You're an expert in this
I think the challenge that we face is that we're actually at the end of a particular era. And by that, I don't mean that it's the end of the West or anything dramatic like that, but it's the end of an era. We're no longer in a phase where the fundamental reality of life is the Cold War between a Warsaw Pact and a NATO force anchored in Moscow and in London and in Washington. We're no longer in an era where the United States is a hegemon, a hyperpuissance, as Paris decided to call it at a particular point, and essentially in a position to be able to impose its own normative frameworks on the world at large. We're in an era where powers, states, nations, whichever way you want to think about them, that were historically dominant in previous eras are reasserting themselves significantly on the global stage in very different ways. If you look at economic growth on a global scale across all of measured time, you'll see that Asia had more than 50% of global GDP until 1870. China was the largest economy in the world until 1820. It was really only the 19th century that caused this enormous interruption, and that was the product of the Industrial Revolution in the West, built on the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, the adoption of scientific method on an enormous scale, and its scaling out into industrial capacity. That economic industrial capacity associated with the ability to project military power transformed the world, colonized parts of the world that had not been colonized up to that point in time, and enabled resource extraction on an extraordinary scale. We created the world, and I'm speaking now as somebody who's part of that Western canon. We created the world in our own image after 1945. And now the time has run out. We're no longer in a position to be able to impose norms that are part of the Western canon on a global scale. So I agree entirely that the negotiation of the future model of globalization, of global development, of sustainable development, of global governance is going to be a negotiated product, whether we like it or not, whether anyone else likes it or not. It is the inevitable consequence of the reality of our times. And that's why I think it's extremely dangerous to imagine that we can continue with the paradigm of the last 30 or 40 years. We need new strategies, we need new insights, and we need an openness to redefine how to make economic growth, which is essential for the survival of all, both socially sustainable and sustainable in respect of the ecosystem in which we're all embedded and on which we depend for our future survival.
Thank you. Now, do we have time for any more questions? Anybody else out there in this Netherland? Yes, sir. I think there's a microphone coming. Here's a microphone.
You haven't mentioned or talked about it in terms of decline, and I don't know whether you want to talk about it in terms of decline, but I have groups that do talk about it in terms of decline, and the decline of American economic superiority, and wondering, and they're wondering whether it's a decline in an absolute sense, a relative sense relative to other countries, or that there's no difference between the two. That if you have the one, you have the other.
You know, I would say that there is a difference in that the increasing affluence of other societies says nothing in absolute terms about one's own success or failure. Unless you really believe that there is a zero-sum competition for resources and growth, and that if anyone else gets stronger, you de facto get weaker, and I don't accept that as a principle of a global system. You know, the only thing that is unequivocally clear right now is that a lot of the rest of the world is becoming much more sophisticated, affluent, dynamic, and beginning to believe that their capacity to write and inscribe their own economic future and vision on the face of the earth is at least as legitimate and possible as the Europeans and Americans, and maybe for a brief period of time the Japanese. Or in the case of China, as Sean points out, to pick up a thread that had been frayed for a couple of centuries. You know, whether that presages the absolute decline of the United States or Europe, I think is a much more open question. A lot of people, you know, have legitimately pointed out that for all of the changed reality of Europe globally, in that it's no longer a series of empires, you know, Great Britain, France, Italy, Spain today, at any kind of per capita material level, are far richer than they were, you know, 120 years ago when they bestrode the world like a colossus. So, you know, even then, decline is a kind of a sensibility about where one stands within the panoply of nations. And the United States really is an open question. You know, all that I feel sure about right now is that, back to your question about time, that the convergence of political systems and political attitudes and cultural attitudes and technological change and global change are not well aligned. So that there's clearly a mismatch between American perception of what's going on in the world and its place within it, and what is going on with the world and its place within it. And whether or not that creates further decline in an absolute sense and not just a relative sense, you know, I think it is too soon to tell, and probably doesn't matter much anyway, in that we either have to do what we have to do, or we're not going to do what we need to do, and either way, it's going to have either good consequences or bad, regardless of what the rest of the world does.
Well, I measure the rise and fall of countries and economies based on the signs in the luxury shops in Paris. And so if I go there and they're in English, and then they're in Russian, and then they're in German, and then they're in Arabic, and then they're in Japanese, and now they're in Chinese, I always know who's rising and who's falling. But anyway, thank you very much for your good questions, and thank you once again, panel, for your exciting.